the trifecta for change is strategy, execution, and reflection. So strategy means you need to take the time to figure out what your goals are. They need to be well thought out goals. They need to be measurable, obtainable, like your typical SMART goals. It's understanding the emotional tie behind it. What's the motivation? All these things fall into the strategy bucket. Execution, right, is simply breaking down your goals into small pieces and just doing it. Ironically, the area that I think a lot of people undervalue is the reflection part. Just like how with fitness, I think a lot of people undervalue sleep and they tend to just over exercise. Reflection is really the part where the magic happens. It's where you go from good to great, because that's where you can really figure out what's working, what's not. It's understanding what your obstacles are and how to create a strategy around that. So to me, that's the formula, right, for creating change. And then rinse, wash, repeat.
Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrisey, where we share insights from great thinkers. Today I'm excited to be joined by Alex Lee, a sales leader turned coach based in Austin, Texas. Alex, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Alex, you held prestigious and high-paying positions at places like Google and MongoDB and Rackspace and IBM. What made you leave sales leadership to go into coaching full-time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, really just want to thank you for the opportunity to be on this podcast. I was taking a listen to some of the episodes earlier and just the quality of content and the knowledge base on yours, right? So it's really exciting to be here. I think to answer your question, it first comes down to this concept, right, of people being on a path towards becoming the person that they think they're supposed to be versus being on a path towards the person that they're meant to be. And I'm not sure if you know who Martha Beck is. She's pretty big on YouTube, but she was actually Oprah Winfrey's life coach. So that's probably the ultimate credential builder right there, being Oprah Winfrey's life coach. But she has this really beautiful quote where she says that human beings have everything they need to be happy. All they need to do is listen to their intuition. But in order for them to do that, they need to first heal from their culture and their trauma. And, the first time I heard that quote, I was thinking, man, this perfectly sums up this philosophy that I had with coaching, where it's that I feel like a lot of times people are on this path to become this version of themselves that they think they're supposed to be. They might pursue success or fortune or fame, things of this sort. And so that was my story as well. So to answer your question, right, I think, I had a lot of, let's say, darkness and pain growing up. And that kind of led my path towards trying to become this version of myself that really wasn't who I was supposed to be at the end of the day. And, that journey kind of just eventually led me towards the realization that I was on this wrong path, and I eventually found what I call my authentic path. And so that kind of led me towards this coaching business and leaving the corporate world.
Yeah. What were the two things you said? Healing from your past and your culture?
Yeah. Healing from your culture and your traumas.
Trauma and cultures. I mean, definitely traumas resonate. You hear there's a lot of talk around healing from your traumas. I haven't heard as much about healing from from cultures. What does that mean to you?
Yeah. So, the way I see it is we are shaped by many different factors. We're shaped by, like we just talked about, our traumas. We're shaped by our just genetic personality tendencies. But then from this cultural standpoint, right, these are things like maybe we have a family that's experienced generational trauma and that's being passed down through the lineage. It could be the actual society or the zip code or the area code that you grew up in. It could be something as simple as being like a first or second generation immigrant, right? So there's so many different factors that shape who we are. And these factors a lot of times kind of kick us off the path and we lose sight again of our, what I call our authentic blueprint. and kind of shapes the blueprint that we think we're supposed to be moving towards.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, like the cultural stuff is really healing from some of the stories and limiting beliefs that might not serve you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, like I think there's a lot of, like when I think cultural, I think it can be, you know, at a family unit and then a community unit. But I think about, you know, beliefs around money, beliefs around communication, beliefs around what's possible.
I would say beliefs are a part of that. But then there might even be like maybe something as subtle as a skill that hasn't been in that family lineage to be passed down, right? So like this concept of, you know, I work with a lot of clients that are first and second generation immigrants, and this concept of like emotional IQ or, you know, things like acknowledging your needs. These are things that are very foreign to a lot of these cultures. And so that would be another example of, you know, just actual skills or important life lessons to be passed down or to be learned.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of your clients are first and second generation immigrants. Like who else, what kind of people are you working with beyond that? Or like how would you think about like what is your client mix right now?
So I'll take a stab at this question or answering this question, but I don't think it's going to be the answer that you're looking for. So
I'm not looking for anything.
Yeah. You know, I've been pretty fortunate to have an extremely wide range of clients. So like on one side of the spectrum, you might have, you know, senior executives at Fortune 500 companies, CEOs, co-founders, extremely successful individual contributors. But then on this other side of the spectrum, right, it might be athletes, musicians, students, small business owners. So it's a very wide range of clients. And I did take some time to think about this recently on there's a feeling that I can feel amongst all my clients, some sort of pattern. And I was trying to figure out like, what is this pattern that I'm seeing amongst all of them? And the best way I can describe it is that at the end of the day, there's something inside of them that it's a feeling of immense frustration or immense pain. And it's something that they've been living with or feeling for many, many years. And not only is it something that they're feeling and they've been experiencing, but it's something where they finally either had a moment of clarity or maybe they've had several moments of clarity where they can finally acknowledge and be vulnerable enough to admit like, man, this is something that I'm running away from. And so I typically find clients at a point in their life where they've hit this tipping point of making this decision of enough is enough. I'm ready to move forward. And that's typically the type of client that tends to resonate with my practice.
Yeah, when I hear you talk about that, I'm thinking about you know, something I heard about coaching, and like, coaching's such a new industry. So there's like, it's tough to hear what's credible, but like when I hear you talk about like healing traumas and like you that's very much, and cultures, that's very much about the past. You know, one time somebody kind of in a quip said, you know, counselors focus on the past, coaches focus on the future. But it, you know, it doesn't seem like you can avoid the past in this practice. When you, like when people come to you, do they even know what questions to ask? Or are they just at a point where they're sick and tired of being sick and tired?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So Tony Robbins has this quote, right, where he says that a coach not only helps you with what you want, but shows you what you actually need. And a lot of times clients will come to me and, you know, in the intake process, we have a pretty lengthy visioning and goal setting portion in our program. And 9 times out of 10, we will very quickly hit these goals in our journey together. But then very quickly, the goals that they listed out immediately or very quickly become eclipsed by something bigger. And I think it's because in this process of coaching together, clients tend to realize that they've been targeting the external symptoms of something deeper. And so, yeah, that's typically been my experience of people think they know what they want, but then by the time we finish our coaching journey, it's like a 180-degree turn from where we started.
Yeah. And when you're like coaching these people and you might have a sense that this might happen, like what commonalities have you found about maybe that second layer of what people are actually looking for?
It's a very delicate dance. Maybe you've had this experience where you have a friend or a loved one, and maybe you just get the sense that there's something like you can very easily see like, oh, they would just work on this or they would just solve this one thing, right? But human nature, right, is that if you just tell them, it doesn't stick for whatever reasons. You have to help someone get to those insights themselves. And so the main thing that I look for isn't really if they have a sense of what might be under the surface. But what I really try to sniff out and get a sense for is how open-minded someone is in general. And I'll have ways where I'll subtly in our interactions constantly be testing to try to get a sense of how open-minded they are and how open they are to change and growth. And I think those things are critical because without those things, the possibility of them stumbling upon their own insights are a lot less.
Yeah. I love the concepts of open-mindedness and growth mindset. Mindset by Carol Dweck's one of my favorite books of all time. Funny enough, like I didn't read it for the longest time because I thought I knew what it was about. I was actually very much demonstrating a fixed mindset in that. Similarly, like I think open-mindedness can be construed. I think oftentimes, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Like I think oftentimes people that might feel like they're open-minded, but they're actually closed-minded, but they just have more progressive stances.
Yeah, I'm smirking because I've been in that situation. Have you read the book "The Power of Now" by Eckhart Tolle and A New Earth?
It's been a long time.
It's been
probably due. I'm probably due.
I forget if it was in The Power of Now or A New Earth, right? But he gives this analogy of where when you think you've transcended the ego, that's the ego coming back into the back door, sneaking back in. And I agree in that. I think that's similar to the concept of like thinking you're open-minded, but actually using that as a stance to maybe feel superior morally or, to actually subtly be closed off to certain ideas. So I resonate with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think about Stephen Pressfield's concept of resistance. Resistance is basically anything that stands between you and your potential. That's also my definition of evil, is anything that stands in between your potential. And, there is a saying, I believe, that there's no enemy in the mind. Everything in the mind is meant to protect you. It might not be serving you. But I think about that a lot as like, and that's why it's helpful to have either close friends or coaches or et cetera, because like, if you can't always see it. And like, if resistance is a force that's been around since the beginning of mankind, it's often pretty cunning and it can actually sound like you.
I love that saying, right? Of, because it comes down to also this concept of our patterns and our belief systems. We wouldn't have them at the end of the day if it didn't serve us in some way. And I like the word you used. You said protects versus something, I think you said serving you, right? And so I think that's a better way of putting it, right? We wouldn't have certain belief systems or patterns if in some way it didn't protect us. And I see that a lot in individuals because with coaching, there's a saying, right, of like, there's a book by Marshall Goodsmith. I think that's his name, right? What got you here won't get you there.
Yep.
And so, Rich Litvin, who's like a mentor that I love watching his content, he says that the biggest enemy to someone's success is success, right? So the very things that helped them get to this certain point will be the exact same things that prevent you from getting to the next point. And a lot of times it could be those belief systems or those patterns that they've adopted. And so learning to help someone see that, like, hey, maybe this belief system has expired and it's no longer serving you. That's a hard pill to swallow sometimes.
Yeah, you got to think about like what's the trade-off by continuing to believe this. Sometimes, like for me, I know it's like, well, if I continue to believe this thing and I stay here, at least I can't fail. Mm-hmm. You know, very common. Were you a big reader in your? You might be a big reader now, but like in your, I'll call it your super high performance days.
Yeah, I would say that I've always been a very curious person, and I've probably have been reading about 1 or 2 books a month for the past 20 years or so. So yeah, I definitely enjoy just absorbing information.
Yeah, me too. For what was interesting for me in like my journey is like, you know, I was probably in some years, I think the most books I ever read in a year was like 45 books, like, you know, like I just like, but it was, my reality was so rooted in intellect. And like, you know, I mean, yeah, like you hear of people reading a book a week, but like, I don't know if that's actually the best thing to be doing.
I would actually kind of agree with you, right? Because when I look back on the books that have had the most profound impact on my life, they were actually the books that just took me like forever to finish. Like The Power of Now was one of them. Like, what a dense book. And every time I tried reading it, I'd fall asleep. And it took me like 3 to 6 months to finish it. But yeah, I think really good information and wisdom, it definitely takes time to digest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also like, I think it just takes time to figure out like what really works. I mean, what question I often think about is like, is it better to read 100 books or the right book 100 times? You know, I think about it like in the world of poetry too. Like I've probably read 1,000 poems, but I have like 10 that like really got me. And those are the ones I spend time with. And I question why we don't treat books the same way.
Maybe it just comes down to an ego thing. Yeah. Wanting to, you know.
I think it's also, it's something is that I think about is like the difference between reading versus studying. You know, studying requires a lot more discipline and sacrifice. It's like, well, why would you want to read the same thing you've already read? And I guess it would be to study and become a master. Even there is a little bit of an ego, but it's like, you know, one of my guests was a guy named Jerry Colonna, and he might have said my favorite line of anybody that's ever been on the podcast. He was one of the first VCs, and now he's a big time executive coach and speaker writer. Incredibly honest. He's like, it's just another example of the wisdom traditions I've tried and failed to integrate for the last several decades. Like his humility around like he's always going to be trying and failing and trying again to integrate this stuff. He's a student. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective to have in life.
Can you speak a little bit to the authentic blueprint?
Yeah. So this is a philosophy that I have that I bring into my coaching practice. I wouldn't say that this is a unique perspective. I think this is something that is can be universally found in different forms when you study different bodies of knowledge, right? But this concept that I believe that individuals each have a very unique purpose in life. I'm not sure if you're a watch collector or an art lover, but I'm not sure if you know the term like one of one. Right. So I believe that every individual is a unique one of one, which means that they have a unique purpose, a unique gift that they can give to the world. And that's going to be based on a lot of things, right? Their life story is going to influence their mission and their purpose, the things that they've had to go through, right? All these things that shaped who they are. And I think a lot of times it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where we maybe have had a few chips on our shoulder and we get disconnected from our purpose and we take on these pseudo purposes. And I think it's really just a form of trying to either prove to the world or prove to ourselves that we have self-worth. And so we, over time, become very disconnected with our intuition or our authentic blueprint. And so the concept of helping people self-discover who they were meant to be and get back in touch with that muscle of listening to their intuition is in line with what that means to live through your authentic blueprint.
Are you familiar with the concept of, this isn't more on the work sense, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. Are you familiar with the concept of shadow careers?
Mm-mm.
Shadow careers are things like you want to be a writer, but you become a writer's agent. Basically, like you're getting close enough, but you're not doing your thing. And then that's not to say like there aren't some people that are meant to be agents instead of writers. Like that's not to say that at all. But I'm curious, like when you're working with people, like do you find that there's a population that is like way far off their track or like actually pretty close, but just like in the shadow?
Honestly, I think it's all the above. Because I can envision someone that is, I guess, doing a shadow career, thinking that this is on path. But, you know, I could see a situation where if you really test and challenge that mindset and get them to connect with their intuition and see if they're actually truly happy, I could absolutely see that going in a direction where, you know, maybe they're settling. But I can also see a situation where, you know, maybe that path of doing that shadow career actually led to something bigger that they were meant to do. So, I'd say that at least from what I've seen working with a bunch of clients, there's a huge spectrum, and it really just comes down to that individual's situation.
Yeah. Two things, you know, you mentioned intuition. Like, I mean, I think we're, not necessarily, I won't call it like a crisis of intuition, but like for a lot of people, it's been very cut off. I'm curious to get your thoughts, like, especially in the West, like, for many people, like I grew up in Ohio, like we didn't go hiking and we were like, kind of like city suburb people, you know, not a ton of nature. I'm curious to get your thoughts on like, especially the healing process and the path to potential, the role of the nature, and then potentially a little bit of a curveball, but also grieving, because I don't believe we appreciate grieving enough. I don't believe in like Western American society, there's enough appreciation for rhythms and seasons. And I know something from my experience is when I am going to take a step towards a new level of potential, I'm going to have to leave some part of me behind. And there was a long time, I have a mentor that talks about cycles of arrival and departure. There was a while in my healing journey that I could tell where I was in the cycle based on an extreme emotional release or grieving. Since it's been a little bit, I haven't had that same sense. And sometimes, you know, maybe it's not grieving, but it's a moment of joy. But grieving was just such a core part of my experience. And I'm curious how you think about maybe they're related, maybe they're not, nature and grieving in addition to finding intuition.
Yeah, I would say that they're absolutely connected. So the image or analogy that I always think of in my mind in terms of someone being their most authentic self is, you know, imagine someone that is this pure ball of just energy and light and goodness. And then things happen, right? Like maybe they get bullied. Maybe, you know, their family hits an economic downturn. Maybe they go through a bad breakup, whatever it is. These little micro traumas or micro events start to what I call put on armor onto this ball of joy. And if you do that long enough, then, you know, we put on this armor thinking that's going to enhance us and protect us. And a lot of times all you're doing is you're starving actual fulfillment and joy from within. And so I think that the process of becoming authentic and getting back in touch with your intuition is the process of taking that armor off. So there's actually a lot of letting go and unlearning that takes place. And I think that that letting go process is probably synonymous with grieving. I have yet to see any clients that I have worked with where we go really, really deep, where some form of emotional catharsis process, or, just grieving or letting go of energy has, not been in that process. It's almost guaranteed that that's going to be somewhere in that process. So I absolutely think that they're connected. And to your point with nature, it's funny because I think the pattern that I've seen with clients is that the people that live the most exceptionally fulfilling lives are the people that have some level of spirituality in their life. And spirituality can just be a bucket term for, a higher purpose, religion. I would actually put nature in that bucket. And so, yeah, I do think that nature is very important. I think also more so because it's symbolic of what I call the bucket of spirituality, which is really just the process of connecting with something bigger than yourself.
When people go, and I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about like your process for sustainable transformation, but I'm curious, when people go through your program, I'll call it, even just saying that, I mean, is probably a false indication that the process ever stops. It's continuous, obviously, but in phases of your program, like, are you finding that people are like radically shifting careers, like getting out of certain relationships, etc.? Or are some people just like returning to the lives they already were living with fresh eyes and like renewed connection and fulfillment? I imagine it's a spectrum, but I'm just curious kind of what you've seen and experienced.
That is a really interesting question. It's kind of ironic, right? Because a lot of times, again, clients will come to me thinking they have a certain goal, like, hey, I want to hit this title. I want to hit this, net worth. And again, we'll work towards that thing, right? So the coaching ROI is a mixture of intangible and tangible results, things that we can measure and things we can't measure. Having said that, because my coaching does focus a lot on really deep work, it is very rare to see a client that I will work with where eventually there will not be some major transition in their life. It could be a huge career shift. It could be, all the things that you mentioned. So that's not to say that that's the measuring mark that we're moving towards, is huge shifts, but it is something that we see quite often.
I mean, in Austin, like it's quite a microcosm. Like you've seen a lot of people kind of drop out of the corporate world. So is that like a common thing you see, or do you see some people very common? Can you speak more about that?
The best I can speak to it is from what I've seen. And what I've seen kind of goes back to the similar story that I had, right? Where I think the corporate world is a very simple and safe platform to pursue pretty much everything you need, right? To enhance your ego, to have enough money to, sustain yourself, to have admiration, respect, all these things. So it's a very safe platform. It's not to say that it's easy, because as you know, you really have to hustle and, work long hours and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I think that pursuing a corporate career a lot of times is an example of really just addressing the symptom. And I think an example of a symptom in that instance is, in that instance for me, it was not believing that I had inherent self-worth because of my upbringing. And so I was looking for an outlet to constantly prove to the world and myself that I had self-worth. And when you work on the actual root cause, a lot of the symptoms auto-correct themselves. And when I no longer felt like I had to pursue something to have self-worth, it was almost like magic that I just stopped. I just one day just lost interest in my career. And I was just like, I think it's time for me to do that thing that I've always been wanting to do. So, I think that the corporate world is, again, not all the time, but a lot of times just a form of addressing a symptom versus addressing the core issue.
Yeah. I mean, something I'm thinking a lot about is like, and that it gets kind of into like, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. You know, sometimes like I've had like other coaches and speakers and authors on here, and like coaching can be a very, I'll call it privileged solution. Like some of the guests I've had might charge like $10,000 a month. So like the accessibility isn't really there, but like like something I'm thinking a lot about is like, you know, economic realities are real. And they're actually growing too. Like, you know, like it would cost, you know, for my experience, 3 times as much to buy the same house I grew up in, you know? So like, how are people like, I mean, there's some people that's for me, like the corporate world is like a good way to like make money, but like there's often also stories around like, is this the game you want to be playing, etc. I mean, how do you think about it for like, from like the broader population? And I know you have a diverse client set. But like from people that maybe like can't do that or feel like they can't leave the corporate world for whatever reason, for financial or family or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very fair point, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm sure you know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Food, shelter at the very bottom. So there is something to be said, right, about being able to sustain yourself. But one thing that I have always found when I work with clients long enough is that, you know, that concept in the 4-hour work week kind of naturally comes out where, yes, there's truth to people needing to sustain themselves, but when you actually quantify what you actually need to sustain yourself when you're at a authentic level of happiness, it is way less than you would actually think. And when you start to realize that the reason people think and feel that they need, you know, exorbitant amounts of wealth is because they're typically coping or trying to, you know, rejuvenate themselves from all the burnout, or it's because again they don't know how to be happy with little things in life. And so, you know, if happiness were an equation, I think most people focus on, you know, trying to increase the numerator, but the denominator of just decreasing and being happier with less is also a very viable solution, right? So I think when people actually learn to be authentically happy and fulfilled, you don't really need that much. And so that naturally lowers the equation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. 2 things stand out is I think Jim Carrey in a graduation speech says, you know, his dad could have been a great comedian, but he was an accountant. He tried to be an accountant because he thought that was a smart thing to do, and he failed at that. And the lesson was like, you know, if there's always a chance of failure, so you might as well fail at the thing that you're like really born to do. The other thing that stands out is like, I had a good friend who, I think traveled, him and his wife, for like 4 years. And he's like, yeah, when we left and started traveling, we left all of our expenses with us. You know, all these things we were working to pay for, you know, travel does seem to be a part of this process. You know, you hear a lot of people like, you know, go travel for 6 months or a year and they learn to live with less, but also like all the things they're working for to get the money, they're just gone.
Couldn't agree more. I had actually, ironically, a similar experience where during the lockdown, I was one of the people in that group that started to do a lot of nomadic stuff. And it wasn't actually to experience travel, but it was because I started to notice that my lifestyle creep was starting to get out of hand. And so I was looking for a drastic way to reset that. And so I chose to basically live nomadically out of my car for like about 2 years and talk about getting back to the brass tacks of living a simple life. And so it was a great experience, right, to help you remember the things that really make you happy. And you really don't need much when you're, you know, living a life that's filled with fulfillment at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the things we spend our money on are trying to fill holes or distract ourselves. And it can be a lot simpler. What have you found to be a process for sustainable transformation? You mentioned like some visioning, you mentioned running out some goals, but like, what does it look like for you?
Yeah. So I think there's two different ways to interpret this question. So on one side, there's what is the process to consistently create change? And then on the other side, I kind of see it as what's the process to sustain change? Because in my mind, they're two completely different things. So on the first side of how to consistently create change, I actually don't think it's that complicated. Like I use the analogy of losing weight. Like in theory, the formula to lose weight is not that hard. It's just, burn more calories than you intake. How you do it, there's a lot of different ways. You could do keto, you could do intermittent fasting, all these things. But the formula at the end of the day is pretty simple, right? So I kind of see it as a trifecta. So just like in health, right, there's sleep, diet, and exercise. I think the trifecta for change is strategy, execution, and reflection. So strategy means you need to take the time to figure out what your goals are. They need to be well thought out goals. They need to be measurable. They need to be obtainable, like your typical SMART goals. It's understanding the emotional tie behind it. What's the motivation? All these things fall into the strategy bucket. Execution, right, is simply breaking down your goals into small pieces and just doing it. Ironically, the area that I think a lot of people undervalue is the reflection part. Just like how with fitness, I think a lot of people undervalue sleep and they tend to just over exercise. I think in this equation, it's the same thing. Reflection is really the part where the magic happens. It's where you go from good to great, because that's where you can really figure out what's working, what's not. I'm 80% near my goal. Is it worth going to the extra 20%, or do I actually want to pivot because I've reflected and I realize I have a new goal? It's understanding what your obstacles are and how to create a strategy around that. So to me, that's the formula, right? For creating change. It's just create a strategy, execute, and take time to reflect, and then rinse, wash, repeat.
You mentioned that reflection is often the most challenging thing. I've heard a lot of friends say, like, I really want to journal, I just can't. And there's many ways to reflect beyond journaling, but what are some ways that you help people that maybe have had blockers against reflection to create the time and space to reflect?
Yeah. So I think reflection can definitely come in different forms. Like you said, journaling, meditating, things of that sort. To me, I think reflection is, at the end of the day, a form of just getting connected with your emotions and actually feeling your emotions. Because as wooey as that might sound, that's a form of connecting with your intuition, right? So whether you connect with your emotions through journaling or meditation or mindfulness or just going for walks, to me, it's at the end of the day, you're just trying to connect and actually feel. Because when you feel your emotions, your body is trying to tell you what the next step is. Your body's trying to tell you this is working, this isn't. And so, I'm not sure if that answers your question directly, but I think it comes in many different forms.
Yeah.
But
I went to a really transformational men's retreat 18 months ago or so. And the core was feel your emotions fully and separate your emotions from your stories.
I love that.
You be like, a great example would be, you might say, well, I feel like you don't have my back. That's actually not a feeling at all. Like that's a story. It's really, and then there's all this like nonviolent communication and ways to communicate that. But like, really, it's like, I know it's not that I don't feel like you don't have my back, is that I feel scared and vulnerable, etc.
Yeah. And what a great, so we use that a lot. It's this philosophy, right? That the story that you're telling yourself or the thought you have is what leads to the emotions, and your emotions are what lead to the actions you do. And what a great way to help someone not only help articulate how they're feeling, but to actually communicate, right? Because in that example, if you feel like a friend doesn't have your back, just telling them like, you don't have my back, or I feel like you don't have my back, that's not effective communication. Effective communication is like, hey, Adam, when you do this, sometimes I feel like I'm a little isolated, or it makes me feel alone. And that's really hard, especially for guys to sometimes open up and say, right? But you can see how much more impactful it is to actually get to the root of what the emotion is.
Yeah. One of my favorite sayings is like, in order to get to where you're going, you have to be here. So I think that's a big element of acceptance, and also just being where you are and feeling your emotions. Are you familiar with Byron Katie? Byron Katie is, she is a coach and author, and her framework's called The Work. And The Work is a 4-question framework that can basically be applied at any time, which is like, is it true? Do I know it's true? Like, could the opposite be true about any story? And then who would I be without this? And one of her quotes I think is really brilliant. She said, I discovered when I believed my thoughts, I suffered, but when I didn't believe them, I didn't suffer. And this is true for every human being. Freedom is as simple as that. I found that suffering is optional, and I found a joy within me that has never disappeared, not a single moment. That joy is in everyone always.
I love that.
Yeah, it speaks to what you were saying earlier about the unlearning and kind of just removing all the stuff that is not the essence of every human being, which is joy. Yeah.
And sometimes suffering can be addictive, right? And, you know, falling into that victimhood mindset, it can be very addictive. And perfect example, right, of it may not be empowering, but it is serving us in some way because it's maybe protecting us or making us feel, you know, one way versus avoiding maybe certain realities. Yeah.
And they're all patterns. Like one of my counselors and teachers said, would say, like, you know, every thought we have is the deepening of a neural pathway, or creation of a new one, or a deepening of an existing one. And our patterns are the same thing. And we can very much get addicted to chaos and shame and all this such. And we need to shift out of patterns. Can you speak to some frameworks and tools that anyone, whether they're working with you or not, can use to gain clarity and improve? I hate the conditionality, but improve their lives.
Yeah. So within coaching, you know, there are proprietary and the non-proprietary tools. The two that really come to mind that I think anyone can have access to and really leverage is the first one is called the Wheel of Life. So, you know, imagine if you're going to go on a road trip, what's usually going to be the first thing you do, right? Is you sit down and you maybe just take a look at, okay, where am I trying to get to? And you take a snapshot of just the entire journey before you figure out the actual route. And so the Wheel of Life is a really simple tool that a lot of people, especially coaches, use because it gives individuals a actual visual image of their current life and where potential imbalances are. So it breaks down your life into 8 or 9 different buckets. So it might be career, finances, intimate relationships, social relationships, whatever. And then you just go through the process of ranking where you think you are and where you want to be. And it gives you a snapshot. And so that's a great starting tool to give you an idea of where you are and to potentially inspire areas of imbalance that you should start working on. So that's going to be the first one. I would be surprised if you couldn't find that by just doing a quick Google search.
I just found it.
So you could.
There's all sorts of different templates out there.
Yeah. And also it's available on my website, and it also has a few different prompts because I think it's one thing to have the snapshot, but you need to have empowering prompts to kind of pull out of you the insights that you're looking or seeing from that. So that's going to be the first tool that I can think of. The second one then segues off of that, right? Of, okay, now that I see the snapshot, what am I going to do with this information? And so there's another tool called AimSmart goals. You're probably aware of what SMART goals are, right? They're goals that are, what was it? I should probably know.
Specific, measurable, attainable,
time bounds, and
Relevant.
Relevant. There we go. So, very common formula to outline very specific measurable goals. AimSmart is a framework that builds on top of that. And what it does is it helps you take these broader stroke goals that you have and teaches you to break them down into further buckets, and then basically break these down into the smallest bite-sized pieces you can figure out. But then instead of creating next steps and goals towards that, it leverages a technique. Yeah, so like Tim Ferriss has that joke, right, where he says, sometimes I'll, write out a goal and then I'll cut it in half and then cut it in half again. And that's the real goal that you want to work towards. AimSmart is very similar, where it helps you break down your goals into the smallest components possible. And then it helps you to create what's the best case scenario of what next steps look like, what's the worst case scenario, and what's the realistic medium that you can actually go towards. And you could probably find that framework somewhere online. You can also, again, find that on my website. But I think that mixed with the Wheel of Life is a great two combo mixture that could probably help someone get started with getting clarity and figuring out how to get some next steps going in their lives.
One thing that's come up for me in that is how do you help people figure out what the main focus should be? Because something for me is like I'll start journaling on this stuff and be like, all right, well, I'm just going to change 6 things in these 7 aspects of life or elements of the wheel, and then I'll be good. Mm-hmm. But I also know that will often lead to being overwhelmed. So how do you coach people to balance the short term and the long term?
Could you clarify? So in your example, what do you mean by these things will lead to this feeling of overwhelm?
I'm just saying if I try to change things across work, relationships, exercise, changing financial goals, changing creative goals. If I try to do all these things at once, I'll sometimes feel overwhelmed. And one of my counselors recently encouraging me is your main focus should be your main focus.
So what's interesting is, hypothetically, if this were a coaching session, I think my goal is to help cut through a lot of the noise. So there's this saying that we have in coaching where you don't get in the ring or you don't get in the box with your client, meaning the actual details that they're sharing are rarely relevant. What you're really trying to listen for is, how do you cut through all that noise and get to that one core thing that's the real issue? So in this instance, hearing you talk, when you say that potentially listing out all these next steps lead to overwhelm, that might actually be the area where we would focus on and trying to understand and just get a better relationship with why do these things make you feel overwhelmed? What does your relationship with that emotion of feeling overwhelmed look like? And a lot of times you might have a client that, through a lot of deep work might realize that maybe that's stemming from, this pressure that their identity is linked to, execution or something. And so if they have pressure to constantly execute, then you can see how this would be a self-sabotaging type of cycle. So by helping people release that energy and find new perspectives on that initial thing that was causing overwhelm, that is actually going to create a way more sustainable approach than trying to work through, again, the symptoms of, okay, well, how do we get you to just focus on these next steps and ignore the feelings of feeling overwhelmed? So I'm not sure if that actually answers your question, but it was actually an interesting, pseudo coaching thought experiment, because that was the most relevant example I've heard come up today.
Yeah, no, that's super cool, man. Yeah, I think I'll definitely be examining my own relationship with feeling overwhelmed and, digging back to our earlier portion of the conversation about how might that serve me? Mm-hmm. And what is my payoff by keeping that, those underlying beliefs? Alex, you've been really gracious with your time. Before I let you go, what's the best way for people to keep up with you and the work you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm super active on LinkedIn. So if people want to reach out to me, connect on LinkedIn, I'm super active there, and usually pretty responsive. And then also just my website, alexlee.life. You can find, some of those tools that we talked about, such as the Wheel of Life, the AimSmart goals. And then there's also an intake form if you want to book time and just have a meaningful conversation with me.
Awesome. Well, we'll have links to your LinkedIn and your website in the show notes, as well as those tools. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Alex.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me, man.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays Morrisey. That conversation was with Alex Lee, a sales leader turned coach based in Austin, Texas. What I enjoyed about the episode was Alex's belief in the potential of people and his concept of the authentic blueprint that everyone has. If you enjoyed the episode, share with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.